Born and bred the son of a smallholder, the tasks of growing crops and looking after animals seemed to me as a boy to be one continuous process, and it involved so many different things that a lot are only hazy in my mind now. I suppose that if I was required to build a corn stack, I would almost instinctively make it so that if the rain got in, it would run out at the sides rather than into the middle to spoil corn. And if ever I had to thatch a stack, I could recall the proper method. It is true that with the invention of more and better machines, the need for many skills diminishes, and it's hardly likely that many which I knew will ever be needed again. I am old enough to remember the time when villages were almost entirely self-sufficient. This was of necessity, because transport was mostly by foot or by horse and cart. Railways served only a few villages, and cars and lorries were so rare as to be something to remark on. That kind of life brought people into much closer contact in their working lives. The chap who made the boots, he made them well enough so that wet didn't get into one's feet. If he didn't, his neighbours complained bitterly. All of them seemed to do their job well. The blacksmith, probably the busiest man of the lot. Horses were shod before breakfast in order that a full working day on the land wasn't interrupted. In hard winter weather, the sharp studs were fitted into horses' shoes, again before breakfast. They had to be able to travel without slipping on icy roads. The discipline of a hard country life seemed to determine how all the inhabitants conducted their affairs. One's environment shapes one's philosophy. And I don't really have regrets concerning what was a fairly work-dominated early life. It taught me that this was the way in which one paid one's rent for the privilege of being alive. Even today this carries over. I have a young neighbour who's farming virtually single-handed. If his mower breaks down at tea time, then I'll help him before having tea with his repairs. This matters because he then has 6 more hours of daylight to carry on a vital job. Similarly, if I want manure for what's a fairly large kitchen garden, or if I want the land ploughing, this is done. Money doesn't enter into this. We help one another. It's the country way, and I think it's still a satisfying one. I suppose my interest in practical things was what influenced me to train to teach children through skills. My formal training in woodworking meant that wood predominated at the start, but I taught in a market town school which drew children from a wide country area, and I soon realised the need for a broader based course. And of the many branches of metalworking which I attempted, forge work seemed even then to offer great opportunities for the development of personal qualities in an individual. Initially, the excitement of a fire with its noise, its sparks, and the prospect of vigorous thumping of hot metal on an anvil attracts boys to try their hand. I've said that there are opportunities educationally in this, and I would think it comes about largely because of the demands made on the individual. Iron and steel are plastic only when they're hot. So the worker has to shape his metal before it cools. In taking a heat, for instance, concentration on what you're doing so that burning's avoided must be fairly high. You have to then act quickly to achieve a result, using initiative to take rapid decisions. A careless extra blow can spoil good work. The mental demands on a student have always seemed to justify forge work in the Crofton design field, putting it ahead of some machine work, in my opinion. I wouldn't think that the operation of, say, a milling machine working through levers, wheels and dials made anything like the same demands on the thought processes of a student. A hand skill, I believe, has two fundamental elements to it: control and formative power. Control's the stage where the basic techniques are mastered. It's the drudgery stage that's common to most skills. Hand skills, sport, football, most of them have this. But when it's passed through successfully, the second element, formative power, can develop. And here, I think, true creative potential through the hands can start to flourish. Whilst the technological society can admirably supply most of our everyday needs through repetitive machine processes, a time comes when the human spirit rebels against the sameness of the industrial product, and one feels the need for something individual. This, to me, is one of the justifications for keeping alive our heritage of craft skills. For with these, one can get the kind of personal satisfaction which comes through individual creative work. When I was very young, we hadn't a church in the hamlet where I lived. It was a mission room, part of a farmhouse, and my eldest sister played the organ. And very often we had a lay reader rather than a vicar who would come to take the service. The farmer who had this particular place had a younger brother who was a little bit slow mentally, and consequently he was the poor chap who had all the farm jobs to do even on a Sunday. And he was always late coming in for the service, this particular Sunday evening, Mary had stopped playing the organ, and there was the short interval when everything's very quiet before the preacher comes along. And suddenly, in burst Henry through the door, full of great excitement, rushed along to his neighbour with the words, "Hey, Charlie, our old Sue's pigged, 13 and all living." And this was such a great moment in Henry's life that everybody heard it, even Mr. Ferrell, the lay reader in the vestry. We had two neighbours who were bachelors, farmers, and they were merry souls, and winter they used to go twice a week to the local inn, buy pony and trap, and this particular night they'd stayed rather longer than they ought to have done, and when they came out, George said to John, he says, "Hey, John, I can't sit, horse's eared." So John said, "Give me reins, I can sit two buggers." A very pleasant memory of childhood is when I was lifted onto sacks of wheat, because after the threshing day, the newly threshed wheat was taken down, perhaps half a ton of it, to the local corn mill, and the journey of perhaps a mile, perched on the sacks with an old mare trundling along, was always pleasant. The swish of a water wheel that turned the stone grinding mill, with the rumbling of cogs, and the cat prowling around the bags stacked up all round the mill, occasional additional excitement of the miller moving the sacks and getting a rat jumping out for the cat to pounce on. They're all quite vivid. And similarly, this same old mare would be entrusted with the job of taking me to the smithy. There wasn't much danger, even though I couldn't really control her. She knew her way, and there was no traffic to bother us. Neighbours were always helpful. In an interdependent community, you couldn't live any other way. And with a horse and cart, they'd always time to stop and chat with their neighbours. Today, with a car, which saves so much time, it's often only possible to put up one's hand as a greeting and keep on the move. In the country, one so quickly hears of anyone in need, and the response is always fairly immediate, because one never knows when a crisis will arise in one's own life, and it's very reassuring to think that one's not alone in a crisis. Self-sufficiency. In the old days, I think, was a tremendous thing. I often think now of when an old farmer retired, 2 days after he'd sold all his stock, he came striding over the fields to see father. The manner of his coming made father realise that here was something that was very wrong. This was his problem. He had all this money and no eggs and no butter, and was now dependent on trips to the nearest town. And he was wondering what to do with all the money. And I think his stability that he'd had previously and hadn't perhaps valued was brought home to him rather forcibly at that point. So possibly we didn't know how lucky we were to be completely self-sufficient in bad winters. One always had one's flour ground at the local mill, and there was always bacon and ham produced on the farm. Butter and milk and eggs were there almost ad lib. And although at times I suppose one regretted the absence of some of the foods, living was possible even in bad times and in isolated places. A rather pleasant legend about the building by Solomon, King of Israel, of the temple in Jerusalem. When this was finished, he got together all the silversmiths and the sculptors, all the artificers who'd had a hand in the temple, and said that he was giving a banquet for them. But when they'd just got started, there was a great noise outside, and in rushed the blacksmith, still quite dirty. And the king wanted to know the meaning of this intrusion. So the blacksmith said, "Well, I haven't come uninvited. I did hear it said that you'd invited all those who had contributed to the building of the temple. And although I had trouble in getting in, I do submit that I had more to do with this than most. Would you ask the chief mason who made his tools, and ask the sculptor who made his chisels, and the carpenter who made his?" And of course the reply was the blacksmith. So the blacksmith was given a place of honour at the right hand of the king at the banquet. But I suppose I've been very lucky in that I've always enjoyed living as I've done. I've got satisfaction from growing crops and animals and from making things. So I don't think I'd alter my life. I have passed through what would seem to me to be the most rapidly emerging farming innovations. The electric fence, which has been invented in my time. The Ferguson system, where farm implements were thought of as being an integral part of the actual motive power unit, rather than where they were just trailed as they were with a horse. Those, I would say, are the two outstanding inventions for agriculture, and they have taken place in my time. I think the escape of countrymen from the drudgery side, which was always present on land work, had been music. When I was very young, there was a string orchestra not far away, composed of quarrymen and forge workers who worked in Wortley Forge, which is quite a well-known bit of industrial archaeology. And these men, largely self-taught musicians, were highly skilled, really. And not far away there was a small pub called the Woodman, and at Christmas time this little band of musicians would wander down to the pub on Christmas morning, and this particular time the landlord, who also kept a small farm not far away, had given them their first drink. This was on the house, and the leader had said, now we'll get ready to tune up. So there they were, all scraping away. Eventually satisfied, the leader turned to the landlord and said, now George, what do you fancy? And this man, being more of a connoisseur of his own particular beverage rather than music, studied hard for a few minutes and said, well, I think you'd better play that again. It sounded very well. Music, I suppose, has been my escape. I don't play an instrument, but I am able, along with about 65 others, to help to make an acceptable sound as a member of a male voice choir. This is the sort of stuff that we do.